Thanks. So what we're going to do now is shift gears a little bit, and we'll spend just a short period of time, maybe about 40 minutes, having something of a debate. I was thinking that we're a bit like the sorbet during a long French dinner. Clear the palate a little bit of what we've heard already, and then be ready for what will follow. What we're going to do is, I am here with two quite illustrious thinkers to think a little bit about the different aspects of addressing inclusive growth and what are those ways that you could actually do so. I think just to start, and I don't know, yeah, that's the first slide. I think, we were just thinking that you almost have like a 2x2 matrix when you think about what you can do in order to drive inclusive growth. You can think somewhat narrowly in terms of those things you can do. You can think broadly, sort of the macro discussion we were thinking about yesterday. And you can also think more about, sort of driving productivity, making the different actors produce more over time, or redistribution, which also has its own merits. And so that's sort of one way of thinking about it, and that's how we were trying to decide what we would actually debate here. If we look at the second slide, second slide? Oh, thanks. So I think, the idea is that you could then sort of take that 2x2 matrix and think about how much time you want to allocate to each of these strategies. And I don't think we have to go into big detail here, but what we're going to try to do here is to take on one aspect of it, which is really this whole question of what you focus on. And what we're going to do is, so I'm here with Lant Pritchett, who's professor of the practice of international development here at the Kennedy School, and Zia Qureshi, who is a senior fellow at Brookings, but formerly the director of development economics at the World Bank. And we're going to look at one particular debatable proposition. And one will be for and one will be against. And I think just because this is an interesting way of sort of exploring some of these issues. So the debatable proposition is, quote, unequal countries should emphasize targeted programs to promote inclusive growth. Let me say that one more time. Unequal countries should emphasize targeted programs to promote inclusive growth. And we're going to have in the for camp, Lant Pritchett, and in the against camp, Zia Qureshi. And I think we'll start with Zia to see why is it that you think the against is Zia. Why are you against the idea that we should be focusing on targeted programs for inclusive growth?
Thank you, Jennifer. Let me first express my thanks for the invitation to participate in this very interesting event. I know there have been many very exciting, innovative ideas and proposals presented and debated here, so which is quite exciting. So thank you for that. On the question, the motion, as you said, I'm going to argue against it, against a narrow sort of targeted approach to promoting inclusive growth, and argue in favor of a broader approach. And the narrow targeted approach, targeted policies, many of which also happen to be redistributive in terms of motivation or what they set out to achieve. They have the kind of the concept of inclusion that they have is more in often related to benefits or welfare, how we can spread the benefits in a better way, so that more people share in the benefits of growth. Whereas the concept of inclusion that provides a better way is not so much sharing in the benefits of growth, but how you can make people become participants in growth. So there is inclusion in that sense, inclusion in the process of growth, how we can engage them more in productive activities, how we can enhance their productivity. So I think that is one important distinction in terms of this debate is to is to how we can shift toward broader policies that would enable more to be participants in the growth process itself, rather than just look at it from the benefit side. And another way of looking at this distinction is that the targeted redistributive policies often end up dealing with the consequences of exclusion, rather than addressing the causes why there is exclusion, why there is lack of inclusion, and often they are static also. Supporting people, actors, agents in situ in their existing activities, programs for small industries, cottage industries, rather than taking a broader view, promoting opportunity, removing barriers to opportunity in a broader way. So that is the first important point that I would want to make, is that we need to shift this discourse to one where inclusion is seen as an integral element of the growth agenda, not something which is an additional dimension, something that is a constraint on growth, but it's integral to that. And if you look at it that way, then you would, when you look at the policy agenda to promote growth, you would think less in terms of targeted policies and or redistributive policies, as some of them are, but more in terms of policies that are broader, that are systemic, that expand opportunities for people to participate more in growth, to enhance their productivity. And there are a number of examples there. Policies that improve access to markets, infrastructure, access to finance, not through narrow programs, but more broader financial sector reform, broadening of access, institutional and regulatory reform of business environment, so there is a more open, competitive business environment, health and education policies in a broader sense that enhance human capabilities to participate in the growth process. Labor market reform, more flexibility, more opportunity for job creation, participation of women. So this is the broad agenda, which is a growth agenda, but it is also an inclusion agenda. And Ricardo Hausmann has written quite convincingly and eloquently about this in terms of connecting people to networks to enhance their productivity, to engage them in production. Recently, I saw in a similar vein a piece by Michael Spence. Connecting people to economy, you were calling for connecting people to networks. So that is the shift in thinking that needs to take place. That when we think of inclusive growth, less of targeting, less of redistribution, and more of this broader, dynamic, inclusive agenda that addresses the causes and brings inclusion integrally into the growth agenda. And the second point, which is related to the limited time, is that with respect to these targeted policies, as I said, many of them also are redistributive. It's not that we need more of them. In many cases, they are not affordable anyway, because in most cases there is fiscal stress. The welfare programs are overburdened, etc. So it's not so much doing more of those sorts of things, but where there are redistributive targeted programs, doing them in a better way, in a more efficient way. There is space for efficient redistribution, efficient targeting. And let me give a couple of examples. If you have sort of subsidy programs like fuel subsidies, etc., which could be targeted or badly targeted, it's an obvious win-win possibility to do away with those, and then reallocate those resources to programs in education, health, infrastructure. That is one example. Other, where there are targeted programs aimed to support the poor, to reorient them so that the focus shifts from welfare or handing out benefits to enhancing capabilities, so that there is participation in growth process, so people increasingly engage in productive activities, generate incomes. The conditional cash transfers are a case in point. That where you have programs like that, some targeted programs, shift the focus to enhancement of capability so people can be connected to the economy, to productive networks. And also on the tax side, I mean, there are possibilities where you can move toward more efficient redistribution or fiscal tax and transfer systems. Like, again, an obvious example is to do away with excessive and regressive tax exemptions, or to rely more on efficient taxes, which are largely paid by the better off, such as property taxes. So to conclude, I have these 2 points. One is to shift a shift in thinking toward broader, more systemic policy agenda, which seeks to connect people to productive networks, to the economy. And second, with respect to the targeted programs, redistributive programs, not more of those, but to make them better, make them more efficient.
Wonderful. Thanks, Zia. So systemic policy initiatives rather than targeted programs. Now, Lant, are you going to tell us about why targeted programs are actually very useful?
I will in a second. But first,
Oh, yeah.
but first, what I would like
That's good.
is, this is it's very difficult to hold a debate until you're clear on like what people think, right? So what I would like everyone to do is, let's take that table that's up on, that you can see, and I'd like you to pull out a piece of paper or pencil that's in front of you. Hopefully everybody has a writing instrument or electronic. And let's just focus on the bottom 2 rows, right? We could have a debate about what should happen in France or the United States about inequality, but that's a different debate. And let's just take the bottom 2 rows of low and medium. So we're talking countries from the range of like, either super low HDI like Pakistan, Kenya, to medium sort of Indonesia, Egypt, right? So that's our range of countries that we might be talking about. And what I want you to do is actually fill out numbers that add to 100 of time, intention, resources, whatever resources you're imagining. I want you to put 2 numbers, right? One is where you think the world's current allocation is across those 4 things. How much attention, focus, budget, whatever, is in narrow targeted CCTs, redistributive schemes, in-kind transfers of commodities. Broad targeted, how much of it is going to social protection. Narrow targeted, how much is going for microcredit, training for micro enterprises, specific rural livelihoods, and broad productivity, infrastructure, access to markets. So write down what you think the 4 numbers are. By the way, you're not invisible. I can see whether or not you're writing, right? I mean, it's not like it's a lit stage and a not lit audience, okay? And then secondly, once you've written where you think the world is, write down where you think the world should be, right? We only know whether there should be more or less if we have some idea of where you think it is and where you think it should be. So write down where you think it should be. So under the numbers that you wrote down of the is, write down the ought, right? And you can either do it for low, I'd just do it for low and medium together because I think we can aggregate those for now, okay?
Actually, when we're in Davos, we have a voting before and after. And then we find out who's been the more convincing of the two.
That's right, because you
But
can't.
we decided not to out anybody.
Well,
in
we
this
in
case.
here in academia, we understand baseline, right? Baseline versus treatment. Okay, now, what I would like you to do, and this is still before I say anything, is just because I suspect some of you were bluffing, I want you to face the table, turn to the person on your start, and turn to the person next to you and say what the numbers you wrote down were. Turn to the person next to you. Pair up, pair up, pair up. You have to say it out loud now. So if you were bluffing and not writing anything down, it's now revealed that you were bluffing. So turn to somebody at the table. Because what we're trying to avoid a little bit is the kind of, oh, a strategy should have all elements, but no strategy has all elements in equal measure, right? So now I'm going to defend why I think the narrow targeted productivity category should be a focal area. And I think it should be a focal area because it's an area in which I'm going to defend the view of my tribe. I'm a very tribal person. And my tribe is a group called development economists. And development economists can make the case that we are now in the position to provide methods that will provide rigorous, reliable, scientific evidence about the efficacy of targeted programs to increase productivity of individuals. Because we can reasonably measure productivity of individuals in a variety of ways before we undertake some targeted effort to raise that productivity. We can measure your wages, we can measure your income, we can measure your agricultural productivity, we can measure your productivity as a firm. We can undertake a delineated, targeted treatment of here's how we would raise your productivity as a firm through business training. Here's how we would raise your productivity as a farmer through exposure to new agricultural techniques. Here's how we would raise your productivity by linking you to other markets. And we can measure after. And we can say, here is your productivity after. And so we can provide you with rigorous evidence of the impact, but we can only do so to the extent that it's reasonably targeted who is being treated. And so if we say, let's increase opportunities in markets by deregulating the entry into sector by having less licensing requirements, it's very difficult ex post to know how much that really benefited anyone. Whereas when we undertake specific interventions on raising productivity of individuals, so I kind of agree that I'd kind of put in these low and median income settings, I would have very small numbers on redistribution. You just don't have the fiscal capacity to do redistribution. But if we do productivity enhancement right, it's self-financing. It's roughly self-financing because we're raising productivity of individuals, right? So we're raising their productivity in ways that actually pays off in a market sense. So the narrow targeted redistribution, I think, is an important focal area in an overall strategy of inclusive growth, mainly because we are in the position to do rigorous science about it, and we've done too little of it, whereas a lot of the things that are in the broad systemic category already are getting a lot of attention, and we actually just don't know a ton about how to measure or do them more effectively. If it were easy to do them more effectively, we would be doing them more effectively. But we're not doing them more effectively, so putting more effort where there's opportunity to be more effective, I think, is a reasonable strategy.
Okay, great. So I think we have two quite interesting perspectives. If I can just stay with you for one moment,
Yeah.
and just ask you, I mean, that sounds very nice, but when you look at all of these sort of smaller targeted initiatives, how do they add up? I mean, how do you think about scale from that perspective?
Well, I guess I think about scale of let's get to scale with what we know how to do and know works, and so worry about scale later rather than first. So a lot of people start with the question about scale and say, look, I could build a highway, right? I could, change industrial policy, and I know that if that were to work, I've started at scale, so it's at scale. Whereas if I go and do, business training for female entrepreneurs, that might work at this small little level, but how would it scale? My response to that is let's do what we can in fact do, right? Because a lot of the broad things aren't happening, quite frankly, because we can't make the politics of them happen anyway. So let's do what we can do, measure our effectiveness of what we can do, and then scale it naturally as an organic process. Will that take longer to get us to scale than if we focused on scale at first? It depends on what you think the pathway to efficacy is. So I would argue doing what's effective at small scale is more effective than doing at scale what isn't effective.
Okay, well, we'll probably come back to that afterwards.
Yeah,
Did you want to ask him something? Well, because, let's finish actually just, ask him the question.
Just to comment on this, I think the narrow targeted programs, some could be good, but the experience in general is that most of these targeted programs are neither well targeted nor efficient or effective. So it's not either or, but in the big picture, what will eventually carry the day on growth and inclusion is the broader agenda, not these smaller programs. And on measurability, yes, if you do something really small, program focused on one person, you can surely measure it. But you are setting your ambition at a low level. So you can measure low ambition. Bigger ambition, you may not measure that the same way. But that's not the right strategy. And scaling up something that starts small, that is something different. That is not the argument between targeted versus a more systemic approach. Even for larger, broader policies, some experimentation may be useful. So I wouldn't want to confuse this debate with that if you are for broader, more systematic policies that promote inclusive growth, that you are necessarily against starting small in some cases to experiment to see what works and what doesn't, and then scale it up.
Okay, Zia, that sounds very nice, but why are we not seeing that necessarily in the policy debates? I mean, what is still necessary to happen so that we actually start seeing action at the more macro level, at the more systemic level on these activities?
Yeah, well, policy reform, as people around here know well, it's difficult. Many involve impacts on different people differently. Some invested interests are challenged. So it's always a governance challenge to implement policy reform. But I think what would help is the kind of debate that we are having and the shift in thinking that we think should happen. How it can help is the following, that today there is recognition that inequality has been increasing. It's an issue. It needs to be addressed. So there is much more attention. It's a welcome development to inclusive growth agenda. But in the political domain, much of that discussion, much of that discourse, very quickly, almost reflexively, focuses on targeted redistributive programs, which certainly when they are redistributive in nature, fiscal, tax transfer policies, they are controversial, they are divisive, owing to perceptions about trade-offs between growth and equity. So what happens is that there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of heated debate, rhetoric, but very little concrete action. And so politicians are especially prone to looking at this agenda through the lens of redistribution and targeted programs, and less through this broader lens of promoting inclusive growth. And if we can shift that and that thinking and have the politicians, the policymakers, look at it, the agenda through this broader lens of inclusive growth, they will see that there is much broader space for consensus on action, because much of this agenda that I mentioned to promote inclusive growth actually is pro-growth and pro-equity at the same time. So it's inherently less controversial, sort of more positive compared to what they end up talking about most of the time, which is redistributive fiscal tax and transfer policy. So I think this shift in thinking will help, granted that reform is difficult business given the political economy and governance issues.